Welcome to class. We've had some lively discussions about JFK in Vietnam on the email list this week, and we'll cover that soon enough, so I don't want to go into it too much, but I think that this is kind of a really a stimulating discussion. I know since I started working on Vietnam, the question undoubtedly asked twice as much as any other one is generally something like, would Kennedy have, had Kennedy lived, would he have gone out of Vietnam or something like that? So there's this real fascination still with JFK, with the Kennedys, as you saw a couple months ago with JFK Jr. So when we get to that, I'm sure there'll be a lot more that we can say about it. But we still have to get to that point. And today I want to cover the late 50s. And today we'll be talking, for the most part, about stuff going on in Vietnam in that period. Last week we finished by discussing the initial American commitments to Vietnam, the kind of resurrection, political resurrection of Bao Dai, who's brought back in 1950 to assume power in Vietnam because there's really nobody else they can go to. And then we talked about the American military's position on the war, which I used the little catchphrase, the can't-do spirit, because the military really was reluctant to intervene in Vietnam, contrary to this kind of Dr. Strangelove type stereotype we have of military officials. With regard to Vietnam, at least, there wasn't anything like that. There was a real reluctance to intervene. And this is especially clear in May of 1954. We talked about Dien Bien Phu. Remember, in May of 54, the siege at Dien Bien Phu ends and the Viet Minh are victorious. The French at that point had requested American intervention. They wanted to relieve their garrison at Dien Bien Phu. They called it Operation Vulture, or in French, Operation Vulture. I think Vulture is an interesting phrase to codename an operation, especially considering the French legacy in Indochina there. So they didn't want to give up that easily, the French didn't, so they had devised Operation Vulture to try to relieve Dien Bien Phu, and the French officials went to the United States and asked for American support, American intervention at that point. Now, civilian leaders in the United States in early 1954 were willing to use Dien Bien Phu as a pretext for committing American forces. However, again, it was military officials who refused to do that. Admiral A.C. Davis, who was a Pentagon official, said, "The involvement of U.S. forces in the Indochina War must be avoided at all costs. The U.S. should not be self-duped into believing the possibility of partial involvement, such as naval and air units only. One cannot go over Niagara Falls in a barrel only slightly." This is what Davis said. "It must be understood," Admiral Davis went on, "that there is no cheap way to fight a war once committed." It's fairly prophetic. This is in early 1954. Now, the civilians, the National Security Council, John Foster Dulles, of course, continued to oppose that. They sent one of their cronies, General John, a man nicknamed Iron Mike O'Daniel, to Vietnam. And O'Daniel came back with these fairly optimistic reports about the situation there. He was one of kind of on the Dulles team, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff continued to give a different view. The JCS said that the Viet Minh held the initiative and identified themselves with, quote, freedom from the colonial yoke and with the improvement of the general welfare of the people. So again, it's U.S. military officials who really have a far better sense of the politics of Vietnam than do the civilians. Despite that, Dulles, Walter Bedell Smith, who was a World War II veteran, a World War II general, and an Assistant Secretary of State, Admiral Arthur Radford, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, only military official really who wanted intervention, continued to press for that. And it was kind of a weak effort because every time they pressed for intervention, they had to admit pretty much how bad things were in Vietnam. Finally, this all comes to a head in late March and April of 54 as Dien Bien Phu's fate is being sealed. It looks pretty bad by that point. Giap has laid siege in the spring of 54, as we know, and things look pretty bleak for the French. The chair of the French Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Ely, E-L-Y, requests assistance and American combat intervention. Now, there have been stories since then and since that they also requested use of the American atomic bomb. And I haven't seen conclusive documentary proof of either the request or whether that was ever seriously considered by anybody. Probably wasn't. But clearly, the possibility of intervention was being widely discussed at that time. Dulles wanted to do it. Radford wanted to do it. Others wanted to do it. It was the military which led the opposition, especially the Army's Chief of Staff, who was a true war hero, General Matthew Ridgeway. You've probably heard of Ridgeway before. What's he famous for? Anybody know? Ridgeway, paratroopers, 101st Airborne in World War II, even more so once MacArthur was fired. In 1950, when MacArthur decides to essentially provoke Chinese intervention by attacking the Yalu, Chinese bases along the Yalu, Truman finally fires him, and Matthew Ridgeway is brought in. I'm sorry, this is in April '51. Matthew Ridgeway is brought in to replace MacArthur as the UN commander, and Ridgeway essentially cleared up MacArthur's mess. Ridgeway immediately cracked down on the ROK Army, which was involved in human rights abuses. He had an incredible reputation, really one of the military giants of the 20th century. He used to walk around with with bandoliers with live grenades on it at all times. So he was a real daring do kind of guy. He just died a year or two ago. He was almost 100 years old. He had been in Nicaragua as an election commissioner in the 1920s and wrote back these really quite incredible reports about the situation in Nicaragua, which the Reagan people probably could have done well by reading in the 80s, talking about indigenous problems there and colonialism and so forth. So he was really kind of a maverick, a really unique military guy. And when American military and political officials started discussing intervention at Dien Bien Phu in '54, Ridgeway immediately and emphatically opposed it. He said that America's ability to do anything in Dien Bien Phu was altogether disproportionate to the liability it would incur, and that would include a greatly increased risk of general war. Okay? So Ridgeway immediately steps in and says, look, we have no real interest there, and anything we gain by intervening, even if successful, is not in any way comparable to what we stand to lose if we don't succeed at Dien Bien Phu. People were suggesting, as Admiral Davis pointed out, let's just send in some air support. And Ridgeway said, no way. Air support really didn't do all that much. Air power didn't do all that much in Korea. And this is something that you're going to see time and again. There's a real conflict within the military over the use of certain tactics and certain strategies. And so I know after the war, one of the major arguments used by defenders of the war has been, that they should have unleashed the Air Force. In fact, the biggest critics of air power and the effectiveness of air power have always been Army generals. And there are turf battles involved in that too, which is really kind of telling. But the fact of the matter is, anytime you make an argument, if we had only done this, you can find another military wing which will refute that. And with regard to air power, nobody did this effectively, I think, as the Army did. Ridgeway said that air power is an unprofitable adventure without any important effects on the fortunes of the soldier on the ground. Okay, so again, it's military officials who reject these kinds of things. Nonetheless, Dulles and Radford continued to press for intervention, and it was Ridgeway and other military officials who continued to dampen their enthusiasm. Ridgeway said that for the Army to fight, it would have to commit at least 7 divisions. 7 divisions in Vietnam, I mean, that's an area of very little, if any, interest. And so Ridgeway saying, the Army can't afford this. We're already committed to NATO. We're committed to Japan. We're committed to defending North America. Why would we send a large contingent of forces to Vietnam? And he said, even if we have air support, or even if we use atomic weapons, we're still going to have to send in a huge group of ground soldiers. He sent a survey team, a technical survey team, engineers and logistics people to Vietnam, and he pointed out something which I think is really crucial, that Vietnam was essentially a terribly underdeveloped country. It didn't have bridge or port facilities. It had a monsoon climate that would limit operations. It didn't really have any kind of communication system to speak of. So before the U.S. could do any kind of intervening, it would have to first build a country. And this is what happens in the 60s. I mean, Brown and Root, from South Vietnam, courtesy of Brown and Root. But Ridgeway says, it's not just a question of sending in guys to fight. It's a question of having facilities there. I mean, where do you land them? There's like one port in Vietnam before 1964. I believe at Cam Ranh Bay, if I'm not mistaken. So Ridgeway says, before we can do anything, what are we going to do? We have walkie-talkies, there's no communications there. It's really a terribly underdeveloped country, and to think about intervening and fighting a major war there is somewhat preposterous. This is Ridgeway's argument. He said that in addition to that, and this is obviously going to be quite telling, quite prophetic, quite prescient, American troops aren't trained to fight in places like Vietnam. He said Army units were too ponderous for the type of guerrilla wars which would be fought there. He said Ho Chi Minh, Von Nguyen Giap, and others are used to that kind of fighting. They're waging a clever war of guerrilla warfare. They often use the term clever, which kind of ties into the stereotype of the inscrutable Oriental and whatnot. So there clearly are these aspects to it as well. But Ridgway's, basically on target that, Americans don't know how to fight this kind of war. We're not trained for it. We're used to sending in the tanks into Europe, and you can't really do that here. So he concludes that any intervention in Vietnam would constitute a dangerous strategic diversion of limited military capabilities in a non-decisive theater to the attainment of non-decisive local objectives. Ridgway talked to Eisenhower. He believed that more than anything, the military's reluctance to do anything at Dien Bien Phu was decisive. Ridgway said, to a man of Eisenhower's military experience, its implications were immediately clear. Now, there are probably other factors why the U.S. didn't, and the U.S. did not intervene at Dien Bien Phu. No one else wanted to go in. The British didn't. There were no allies. But probably as much as anything, it was the military's resistance to do so that was really important. I mean, Ike knew these people very well. He had fought with them. They had been his fellow officers during World War II. And so when they almost unanimously, with the exception of Radford, go to him and say, this is a mistake, this is a no-win situation, he listens. Yeah.
How many men would the French have had at Dien Bien Phu, that entire theater?
Did I say that?
Roughly?
I think, well, in Dien Bien Phu, what did I say, 30, 40,000? That could be off. I think I said I was going to look that up, and it was a lot. a whole group, yeah, a whole slew of them. I think that's the precise term, a whole slew. Yeah. So as much as anything then, Dien Bien Phu, America doesn't intervene at Dien Bien Phu in large measure, I think, because of the military, other factors as well. I don't want to give them Ridgway all the credit, but that's really, quite important. I mean, when your military says we don't want to fight, then you ought to listen to it. Okay? So this can't-do spirit continues then. But even though the United States did not intervene, it does take over the French role and assume control for the war. Ridgway, I unfortunately don't have the quote here, but in his memoirs, which he published, I think, in 1956, has this very poignant passage where he says, to that great list of tragic interventions that never occurred, I'm happy to, or when the day comes for me to meet my maker and account for my actions, the thing I'd be most proud of is that I never included Indochina in that list of tragic accidents or something like that. He called it a harebrained tactical scheme. So, it's quite moving the way he says it. He was quite proud of the fact that in 1954, he played a major role in keeping the U.S. out of the Vietnam War. That victory, however, was short-lived. It was Pyrrhic, because clearly the U.S. takes steps in 1954, though short of war, which essentially take over the French role and lead the United States, if not inevitably, compellingly, into the path of war in Vietnam. I mean, this is one of those great counterfactuals. When could the U.S. not have gone to war in Vietnam? And you can pick a date and make an argument for it, and, it's probably just as legitimate as anybody else's. I mean, 54 is a big one, though. I mean, perhaps Kennedy maybe had the chance to pull out, but 54 is a big one. I think it's real tough to see, once the U.S. sets into momentum this support in Vietnam, how it can pull back, and it clearly does that. The U.S. essentially invents another country and assumes responsibility for its independence. Okay? It assumes training for this army, and it helps them avoid unifying the country. How does it do this? Well, there's a conference at Geneva, and this is just a document which describes the Geneva Declarations. There's a conference on East-West affairs, which is scheduled, it's been scheduled well in advance of Dien Bien Phu for May of 1954, Geneva, Switzerland. And basically the major powers are going to get there just to talk about the world situation. Well, Giap and Ho, as I said, are very clever, and they're strategically they understand how to mix politics and military affairs very, very closely. And they know that this conference is scheduled for Geneva. So essentially they push the Dien Bien Phu siege so that it ends before or while the conference is in session, and they do this perfectly. I mean, the timing, central casting couldn't have done this any better, right? So Dien Bien Phu siege ends, boom, Geneva. So everybody goes to Geneva, and Vietnam, of course, now is at the top of the agenda because the French have been kicked out, and it seems like France now, France has to leave. And again, like in 1946, Ho Chi Minh thinks he's independent. And he essentially goes to Geneva to have that confirmed. He expects the conference to confirm his leadership of a united Vietnam. Well, that doesn't happen. What happens? Well, the United States, more than anybody, guts the Geneva Conference and guts the effects of the First Indochina War. Vietnam is on the front burner there, but the United States was hostile to any kind of negotiations with Ho Chi Minh, also with the Chinese who were there. Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister, represents China there. And the United States, led by John Foster Dulles, refuses to recognize Ho Chi Minh as the leader of a unified Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This is the name of the North Vietnam. It's the DRVN, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and that equals the North, Northern Vietnam, and that's Ho Chi Minh. All right? Ho's claim is that, this is it. This is my country now. Okay? Well, instead, the United States comes up with the idea of partitioning Vietnam, cutting it in half, and creating a country below the partition line, which will become known as the RVN, the Republic of Vietnam, equals south. All right, and I'll give you more on that in a second there. So what's the U.S. do? And this isn't a great map, but it's somewhat useful. The United States essentially cuts Vietnam in half, and they do this at the 17th parallel. 17th parallel is right around here, if you can see that cursor. Right above where Da Nang and Hue are. It's just barely above that. Okay? Hue is one of the northernmost cities in what will become the RVN, which is the southern half. And it's divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, the DRVN, thinks they've been sold down the river. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they just defeated the French, they've won the war, they're going to Disney World, right? And all of a sudden, at Geneva, the United States says, no, we're going to cut the country in half, right? Well, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union are also at Geneva. What do? I mean, they're all commies, they're all in the same group, right? I mean, Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Stalin's dead by now. The Soviet Union, I forget, I think Gromyko probably actually represented the Soviet Union there. I mean, they're all the same, aren't they? Well, in fact, when it comes time to discuss Vietnam and the partition, the Soviet Union and the Chinese essentially back off. They refuse to support Ho Chi Minh's claim. The Chinese and the Vietnamese, as we know already, don't get along terribly well. China has other issues that are far more important than Vietnam, especially getting into the UN. The People's Republic of China was formed in 1949, yet who held that seat in the United Nations for the next 30 years? Taiwan did. Chiang Kai-shek did. So China is way more concerned about trying to get this seat at the UN than it is, Vietnam. They don't terribly like the Vietnamese anyway, so the Chinese and the Soviet Union do nothing to help Ho Chi Minh. He's essentially abandoned. The Viet Minh believe they've been sold down the river by these two so-called allies, the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So Ho Chi Minh is frustrated, he's angry, but as part of the Geneva settlement, this is supposed to be not a permanent solution, but a temporary partition. And elections are scheduled for 1956. Geneva does a lot of stuff, but the two most important things to remember are it cuts Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel, and it also says that elections will be held in 1956 to unify the country and elect a single president of a unified Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh says, okay, this is a loss, but it's a temporary setback. The partition is temporary. 2 years from now, we'll take care of things. Okay? Ho Chi Minh talks to people in Vietnam. He gives them a speech about it, and he says, he shows both his anger and frustration, but his hope for the future. He says, to demarcate those areas within which forces are regrouped is not the same thing as to divide the nation. This is a provisional measure aimed at the successful reunification of the country. Our compatriots dwelling in hitherto free regions will now be temporarily occupied by the enemy. Will have grounds for discontent. Some will take a black view. They will despair and possibly allow themselves to be exploited by our adversaries. We must make them realize clearly that, in the interest of the whole country and its lasting interest, they must be capable of enduring the present. Doing so will bring them great honor. The nation will be grateful to them. accept the fact that you're going to be occupied for a couple years, but in the end, this is a great victory because it means 2 years from now we will be reunified and independent. Okay? Jean-Luc Couture, who is Ho's probably major biographer, says that men who had reaped so heady a military success as Dien Bien Phu, after 8 years of exhaustive effort and extreme privation, who controlled 2/3 of the national territory, and who sensed that their prestige in the Cochin China region in the south was gaining strength, that men in such a strong position should have decided in favor of relinquishing much of the ground they had won and of leaving the best and richest areas in the hands of their foe, can be explained only in terms of the intervention of a great national figure, Ho Chi Minh. Ho essentially allows the United States to take away the best of what he had won in the hopes that in the future things would clear out. Okay? He's staking great faith in the eventual reunification of the country. These elections are scheduled for 1956, just 2 years from now. What happens when those elections are held? Well, everybody who analyzes the situation in France, in Vietnam, and in the United States comes to the exact same conclusion. Ho Chi Minh will win easily. Ho Chi Minh would be a runaway winner in any free and fair election. The Department of State, the military, and Dwight Eisenhower all concede that in a free election, Ho Chi Minh wins 80 to 90% of the vote. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, in an official paper, in an official intelligence estimate, says based on any settlement based on free elections would be attended by the almost certain loss of Indochina to communist control. Now, he's not talking about a communist coup, a communist takeover, a military cabal, or anything like that. He's talking about free elections. Communists win free elections. Okay? This is the great fear there. So the United States has real issues with that. They're reluctant to do that, and so instead they essentially take over the French role, right, in Vietnam. And we'll see in a minute what happens to those 56 elections. They're canceled. The United States refuses, along with the South Vietnamese, do not allow them to go on. So what happens then? So the United States has cut, yeah.
I just want to ask you briefly, what is the role of the French in Geneva? What are they advocating? Do they care? Are they hands-off at this point?
France, in retrospect, played it fairly smart. They were smarting from the loss, and they didn't want to relinquish control. But they essentially saw the writing on the wall far better than anyone else did. In a little more than a year, in 1955, they were out. They were gone. So the French essentially, kind of understood that they were defeated, and they moved on to Algeria, where they were defeated too.
I know that at some point later on they become very critical of American sort of maneuvering in Southeast Asia. Does that begin immediately? Has that begun by the time of Geneva?
No, because in the late 50s, Vietnam, as we'll see, seemed to be taken care of fairly well. So no, it's more into the 60s where France is very upset, and that has a lot to do with international politics. I mean, it's kind of ironic because the United States thought France should just get out of Vietnam because it wasn't important, and they had more important things to do. And basically, the French come around to thinking the U.S. needs to get out of Vietnam because Europe's way more important. We have other things to deal with. So it's a very similar argument, quite ironically, 15, 20 years apart. But in '54, the French, realize they're defeated, and so they don't really put up a fight. I mean, they're probably glad to see a partition, but they don't have a major role to play. This is essentially a U.S. decision, and once the Soviet Union and the Chinese don't balk, then it's pretty much a done deal. It would have probably been anyway, but even so, I mean, Ho is isolated. Ho's isolated, and at that point, Vietnam clearly, when you look at things like recognition and so forth, it tends to be recognized by socialist countries and whatnot, so it's clearly being divided. Now, I think the U.S. never really intended on unifying the country. I mean, that seems fairly clear if you look at the documents, but Ho Chi Minh continues to put great faith in this. So the U.S. has divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. You now have the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, and Ho Chi Minh's clearly in power there. And in the south, what do you have? Well, you have something, but what? I mean, the key now is to create something below the 17th parallel. As the war goes on, from 1954 up to 1973, for nearly 2 decades, this is really what the war is going to be about. Who the government in the South is, who it ought to be. Right? The Viet Cong, Viet Minh, National Liberation Front, DRVN, what do you want to call them, will always argue that there was no country below the 17th parallel, separate from what was above the 17th parallel. They will argue that this was an artificial, fictive state. It was invented by the United States. It had no legitimacy of its own. So this is what the war is about. The war is about who the government below the 17th parallel is. Okay? Well, the United States has to find one, yeah.
Now, did Ho ever realize the consequences of being recognized as a communist? I don't really understand. I mean, I know it's a philosophy, but I mean, because the United States, their whole objective was that it was a communist country. Now, did he realize that that was what was causing a majority of his problems?
Yeah, I mean, he understands that. He's quite clever. He kind of wants it both ways. I mean, at one point he says, you can't trust the Americans, they're capitalists to the core. On the other hand, he does, especially in 1945 and 46, he sends like 8 letters, 8 messages to Washington, to Harry Truman, to request assistance. He believes that the United States, if it sees that he has democratic ideals and strategically can be a counterweight to Chinese influence after 1949, that the United States might bite. Maybe they can deal with him like they're dealing with Tito in Yugoslavia. Yeah, they're communists, but they're not so bad. They have ideas which are compatible with Western interests, and neither of them like the Chinese. So, I mean, Ho understands that. He's not going to recant his. He's a member of the founding member of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. He's very proud of that, and he's not going to recant. And it would be stupid to do so. Even if he did, no one would buy it. So, yeah, he understands that, but he also thinks that the unique historical circumstances in Vietnam might make it possible for the U.S. to negotiate to deal with him, to recognize him. I mean, but he's not terribly optimistic either. I mean, he makes the efforts, but like he says, these people they're capitalists to the core. They're worried about their own interest, and, we're not going to hold out much hope. So I think in the end, he's hoping that, he'll wear the U.S. down, which is what happens, or the U.S. will just lose interest and leave, which didn't happen. Well, it kind of did, actually, which we'll deal with in week 12. So, but in 1954, he's hoping that things will work out, that they'll be unified. The U.S. has to deal with the situation. What's it do? It has to essentially create something below that. And the first thing it has to do is find somebody, okay? And they find a Mandarin, not in Vietnam, but in the United States. One of the problems the U.S. has is that inside Vietnam, the dominant national leader, overwhelmingly, is Ho Chi Minh. Okay? I mean, he controls the vast majority of support. He's terribly popular. He's the George Washington or the Joan of Arc figure there, which is a term often used by Americans. They admit it. William Westmoreland admits that. Lyndon Johnson admits that. Dwight Eisenhower admits that. Everybody admits he is the founding father of Vietnam, the most popular guy there. So you have to find somebody to be a counterpoise to Ho Chi Minh. Well, there are some other figures in Vietnam who are credible, but they're communists. And those who aren't really agreeable to the United States because they're nationalists. So as the U.S. surveys a list of Vietnamese who it could use as a counterpoise to Ho, it's these communists and nationalists, none of whom it feels very comfortable with. So essentially, and this is again very telling, where does it go? It has to go to New York to find somebody to run South Vietnam. And it chooses a Mandarin named Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay? And there are some pictures of Diem. We'll talk more about him. There's just a picture of Diem himself. This is Diem's family. We'll talk more about that. That's his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and his Nhu's wife, Madame Nhu. And here's a great picture of Diem and an American military official. And it might be Radford. That would be my guess, but I'm not gonna swear on that. That's Arthur Radford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But I'm just guessing that might be who that is. So this is Diem. This is the Ngo family. Actually, the full name in Vietnamese, the family name comes first. So it's the Ngo family, Ngo Dinh Diem. And his brother's name is Ngo Dinh Nhu. We'll talk more about him too. Okay. So this is the Diem family. Now, Diem was Vietnamese. Okay? And he actually had nationalist credentials, and in fact, he fled Vietnam in 1944, I think, during World War II because he didn't like neither the French nor the Japanese. He did believe Vietnam should not be dominated by these outside powers. So he flees the United States. He's a devout Catholic, and this is going to be quite important later because Catholicism is fairly small in terms of percentage in Vietnam society. It's 10 to 15% of Vietnamese are Catholics, and the vast majority are Buddhist. So Diem is Catholic, and while he's in the United States, he stays at a seminary in upstate New York, and he makes very influential friends because he is a well-known Vietnamese from a very fine Vietnamese family. He comes from one of the better families. Remember, what was it? Diem's father And Ho Chi Minh's father helped found the same academy or something like that. I can't remember what it was. I mentioned a couple weeks ago. So he comes from one of the finer families in Vietnam. So he's already kind of has access. And while he's in New York, he makes very influential friends, especially Catholic friends, including, maybe most importantly, a young senator from Massachusetts from one of the finest families in the United States, John F. Kennedy. Okay, he gets to know JFK very early on, while JFK is still a congressman and then becomes a senator. Mike Mansfield, who later will become the Senate Majority Leader from Montana, and Francis Cardinal Spellman. And if you don't know anything about Spellman, you really got to find out. What a character. But Spellman is the head of, essentially, his nickname was the American Pope. Spellman was the Bishop of New York, but he was more powerful than that. I mean, Spellman was one of the greatest cold warriors in the world, and Spellman had power, and he took care of his own.
Like Richelieu.
Yeah, the American Richelieu, there you go. So Spellman and Kennedy and Mansfield and other people, they even create a group called the American Friends of Vietnam, which is funded with a lot of Catholic money, and they support Diem. So in 1954, the U.S. kind of comes a-looking, and who's it find? Well, it finds Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem had been in a seminary, he was unmarried, he didn't drink, he practiced celibacy, but he was a chain smoker. Any American official who ever met with him will tell you he just sat there smoking cigarettes nonstop for 3 hours, and he would quite often talk and never shut up and let the Americans talk to him. So he was a bit of an eccentric character too, and as we'll see, his family was pretty interesting as well. Right? So the United States finds its leader in Ngo Dinh Diem, and in 1954, it persuades Bao Dai, who would rather be, in the brothels and at the gaming tables anyway, to appoint Diem as his prime minister. Diem hated the French, so to that extent he was a nationalist. He did not know a whole lot about Vietnamese society, especially the way things had developed over the past 10 years because he'd been in New York. And he didn't have a deep and abiding concern for the Vietnamese people. And Diem had his fans at the time and still does, but it's fairly clear. I mean, when you look at some of the stuff he did, he was not exactly, the Father Flanagan of Vietnam. But he wasn't Bao Dai, he wasn't Ho Chi Minh, and essentially the best you're going to do. So when it came time for the Americans to find somebody to lead this country, whatever it is, this geographical entity at this point below the 17th parallel, they choose Diem. Okay? And this country will come to be known as the Republic of Vietnam, the RVN. So this is kind of the lineup. In the north you have the DRVN, Ho Chi Minh's country, and in the south you have the RVN, which is Ngo Dinh Diem's country. Okay? So this is it. Later on, Homer Bigard, who was a reporter for the New York Times, described American policy with a little rhyme: sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem. And this kind of becomes U.S. policy for the next almost decade, close to a decade. Sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay? So what's the U.S. do? Well, the U.S. continues to support Vietnam, and especially Diem. Here's a letter from Eisenhower shortly after Diem takes over in 1954. Okay? And Eisenhower, and if you get a chance, you ought to read this, print it out, and take a look at it. There are a couple things in there which are important. One, the settlements said that there would be a time period, I can't remember exactly how long it is, in which people could move to north and south, from north to the south or from the south to north. There would be a free flow of people, a resettlement process essentially. Okay? In the north, the Catholic Church and the Vatican put out kind of the alarm, sounded the alarm about Ho Chi Minh and the communists. And so hundreds of thousands, some figures go as high as 1 million, people moved from the north to the south. The majority of these folks are Catholic. Others who are strongly anti-communist do the same. There are also a smaller number, but a significant number, of Viet Minh veterans who move from the south to the north. So there is a relocation, a resettlement. Diem uses this as a reason to ask the U.S. for aid, and Eisenhower says, your recent requests for the movement of several 100,000 loyal Vietnamese from areas which are passing under a de facto rule and political ideology which they abhor are being fulfilled. I am glad the United States is able to assist in this humanitarian effort. So U.S. support is put in the guise of humanitarianism. Okay, so Diem gets this initial infusion of U.S. aid. But something else which I think is really telling toward the end of this document here. It's toward the end. The United States is going to give aid. The government of the United States expects that this aid will be met by a performance on the part of the government of Vietnam in undertaking needed reforms. And this is going to become a mantra for the U.S. there. It's going to consistently tell Diem that the Vietnamese are going to have to clean up their act. They're going to have to institute reforms. And the implication there is that, if you want to keep getting help from us, you got to clean up your act, okay? That's never more than an implication. And in fact, it's really never more than lip service. The U.S. never really uses any leverage against Diem. So, yeah.
And perhaps also did they mean by reform that they did? You're going to have to do it our way. You're going to have to reform the way they've been doing things and start doing
and
things
in
our
fact,
way.
I mean, one of the problems with Diem is that he was always derided as a puppet of the United States. And I guess if you consider taking American money being a puppet, you can make that claim. But in fact, Diem, it's kind of ironic. Let me kind of go off on a bit of a riff here, a long-winded answer to your question. There is often a point at which small countries with authoritarian or totalitarian or dictatorial leaders, whatever you want to call them, end up having power over the big guy. I mean, you kind of become important enough that you can call the shots and you have leverage. And Chiang Kai-shek understood this. The U.S. was never going to pull the rug out from under him because the alternative was Mao Zedong. And Diem understands this too. And you see this time and again, especially with right-wing dictators. Despite the horrors and the abuses and things like that, they understand that the U.S., given the context of the Cold War and the needs of the U.S., the U.S. isn't going to pull the rug out from under them. And so even though they'll hear the U.S. complain and whine and moan, they can get away with pretty much all they want. And Diem understands that. So in fact, it's like the old line about debt. If you're going to go in debt, really go into debt, because if you're a little bit in debt, the bank controls you. But if you're deeply in debt, you have control over the bank, right? It's when all these third world countries in the 80s went into debt. They could write the terms of the renegotiation because they were, the banks needed them. The New York banks needed them. So, I mean, in a sense, the U.S. becomes so reliant on Diem that he can write the terms of the agreement. And that's what he does. And he's very, very clever that way. So Vietnam is partitioned along the 17th parallel. Ngo Dinh Diem is in charge, and the U.S. pledges support. Okay? But from the beginning, this is problematical because the United States understands that Diem is not exactly a small d Democrat. Whether Vietnam has any tradition of democracy can be debated. Whether Ho Chi Minh was a Democrat has been and will continue to be debated infinitely forever and ever. But there's not a real good tradition of that. And Ngo Dinh Diem doesn't have real strong Democratic small d credentials. He has better Democratic big D, as in Democratic Party credentials, actually. And so the United States has problems with that. And they see the way Diem is running the country. There are I'm kind of merging the Collins mission and the sect crisis. There are a lot of sects in Vietnam. Sects are kind of, I don't want to use the term gangs, they're more than that, but they are groups of individuals who have both legitimate business and somewhat criminal activities, okay? And some of these gangs, the most important are the Cao Dai. Actually, that's HAO. And if I pronounce this correct, I win an all-expense-paid vacation, too. I think it's, were you in? Waha, I think, and the Binge Win. Okay? These are the most important of them. These groups have great autonomy, to use a bad comparison, but if you're familiar with, like, politics in Chicago in the Mayor Daley era, they would be like, kind of important constituencies, like aldermen or something like that. And in fact, for example, the Binge Win paid off the government $1 million, which is a fair amount of change, to appoint one of their representatives as the chief of police in Saigon, so he could, kind of watch things go by. Yeah.
What were these sects organized around? We've been referring to them. Were they religious-based?
They're religious and business-based, and some ethnically, but they're religious-based, mostly Buddhist. It's real hard to kind of give a specific definition of them because they often combine different elements. I mean, some sects, for example, have strong Chinese influence. There's a section in Saigon called Cholon, C-H-O-L-O-N, which is the Chinese business center. And I think it's the Binge-Win who are very influential there. So they have connections to these Chinese merchants. So it's kind of a combination of business, ethnicity, and religion. All right? But they are a political force unto their own. They are kind of an independent political force, right? Like a PAC would be today, like the NRA or the tobacco lobby would be today. This is kind of what they are. They're quite powerful. And so Ziem has issues with the sects. They don't want to give up power. And Ziem sees himself as a strong leader, and he wants to create a strong country, right? So the sects don't want to give up power, and Ziem's haggling with them. There's no real democracy. There's no real democratic reform. In fact, as we'll see, Ziem reverses a lot of the Viet Minh's policies on land reform, so there's no sense of democracy there either. So the U.S. sees early on that this can have some problems. So it sends an American military official, a fairly well-known guy there named J. Lawton Collins, okay? And Lightning Joe was his nickname. And Collins is sent to Vietnam essentially to get the lay of the land and to figure out what to do with Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay? Collins immediately sends back fairly bleak reports of the situation there. He's starting to sound like Matthew Ridgeway and the rest of these guys. Collins says, Ziem doesn't have any real interest in reform at all. He's not terribly popular. He's repressive. You already see opponents of the regime are being tossed into jail and whatnot. So Collins goes so far as to suggest that the United States withdraw support from Ziem, just abandon him, and let the Southern Vietnamese try to find a leader on their own, somebody who wouldn't have the sense that, Ziem is clearly put in power by the U.S. So there's this clear taint, more than a taint, of being a puppet in that regard. I mean, he's there because the U.S. picked him. He's not Vietnamese, and the majority, I think it's safe to say, of non-communist Vietnamese nationalists don't particularly like Ziem either. They believe that they have a lot more credibility than he does, but their nationalism scares the U.S. because, again, nationalism, even if it's anti-communist nationalism, sometimes is antithetical to U.S. interest. And so this, as I said, it gets complicated. Yeah.
Who actually approached Ziem about becoming the head of the country from the U.S.? I mean, was it Kennedy or was it Mansfield or was it through official channels through the State Department?
It was through the State Department, right.
So his perception of how he got there was, there's no question about his having gotten there from the U.S. as opposed to him just wanting to be president and sort of getting support from the U.S.
Yeah, but at the same time, he comes from a very fine family, and there is a sense of privilege and entitlement there. So even though, he understands that the U.S. put him there, he believes that's where he belongs. Kind of like a Kennedy, isn't it? So, editorial comment there. But, so, yeah, I mean, I think, in a sense, it's not that important. It's not really a chicken and egg argument because there's really a convergence of agreement there. So, J. Lawton Collins is saying, we ought to think about abandoning this guy because it ain't going to work. Well, while that happens, the sects decide they want to get rid of Ziem too. And in fact, in the spring of 1955, the sects have their own private army, they're militias, and they go after Ziem to the point where they shell the palace and attempt a coup. Ziem rallies the army actually listens to him, and there are allegations and rumors of payoffs and things like that at the time, and they defeat the sect attempt to overthrow him. At this point, to use the famous words of Arlo Guthrie, Dulles says, he's our boy, right? And the United States sticks with Ziem. So even though he comes to Vietnam in the summer, fall months of '54, he's really, on pins and needles until the spring of '55. I think it's in April when the sect crisis is diffused. And at that point, it becomes literally sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay? So the United States now believes that it has in Vietnam the means to create an independent country. And it begins to take a far more important role there. And it does this in two specific ways in 1954 and 55, which are interrelated. It creates a training mission to help essentially create an army in southern Vietnam, and it creates a regional group for Southeast Asia, like it did in Europe, called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Okay, And again, these developments occur with great military reluctance. Eisenhower and Dulles go to the Army and they suggest developing a training mission. At this time, once the French leave, which they begin to do, especially in full measure in 1955, the Vietnamese are going to need an army of their own. There was something called the VNA, the Vietnamese National Army, but it was essentially a French creation and it wasn't terribly effective. So the U.S., above all, if it's going to maintain this as an independent country, which despite the claims of having elections in 56, clearly it's going to do. I mean, if they're going to unify the country in 56, why is it so important to them to build an independent army before that? I think it's pretty clear everyone understands that the U.S. sees this as a permanent partition, or certainly at the very least a very long-term partition rather than a 2-year deal. And so the United States has to create an independent army there. Now, the U.S. understands, again, that politically Diem, even though he survived the crisis of the sects coming after him, is not terribly stable. In fact, even Diem's friends understand that he has problems. Colonel Edward Lansdale, he will later be General Edward Lansdale, who's a real character, a real famous figure in the Vietnam era, took a trip to Saigon in 1954 and 55, and he said that any prospects for a stable, pro-American, and that's real important, that's what stable means, pro-American government in Vietnam, were gloomy. He had invoked Mao Zedong's axiom that the guerrillas and villagers have a relationship like fish and water, okay? That like fish need water, guerrillas need villagers to support them. And he said the Viet Minh were good at that. They had excellent, exemplary relations with the villagers, whereas the Southerners, Diem's army, was, quote, adept at cowing the population into feeding them and providing them with girls, okay? So even Lansdale, who's Diem's best buddy and biggest booster, says the Viet Minh know how to deal with the local population, whereas the Southern troops essentially are coercing the population. Okay, so when Eisenhower and Dulles asked the military to establish a training mission, there's a real sense of alarm and concern there. Ridgeway is still the Army Chief of Staff. He's deeply concerned about it. He says, and this is going to become something of a mantra for the military, if we are given this training mission, we are going to be in what Ridgeway calls the invidious position of bearing responsibility and blame when things go bad. Okay? We won't have any control because we don't think the South Vietnamese are really going to be terribly effective. But when it goes bad, who's going to get blamed for it? We are, because we didn't train them well enough. Ridgeway has 2 of his major planners, including a very well-known General, James Gavin. Gavin is one of the major figures in the military at this time, James Gavin. He had been part of the liberation of Berlin in World War II. 82nd Airborne, right. And he asked Gavin and some others to analyze this need for a training mission, and Gavin writes, South Vietnam has a leader of questionable ability with no firm support. However, communist troops in the South are laying the groundwork for a strong armed dissident movement. Before long, civil war will exist with the dissidents ostensibly not supported by the Viet Minh. That's worth repeating. This is what General James Gavin says. Civil war will exist with the dissidents not supported by the Viet Minh. What's that mean? So who are the dissidents going to be? Southerners who are opposed to Diem, who are not communist. Okay? So this is what Gavin sees, a non-communist resistance to Diem developing. Did you have a question earlier?
Does the State Department understand, in working with Lansdale, what the CIA is doing to gain power? A real mental block that I've got is how can we be so knowledgeable and manipulative to go in and take the heroin traffic and gain control from the big power bases, the sects in South Vietnam, and still say we really don't understand the power base that Ho Chi Minh had, and label it as we would Stalinism when it clearly was not.
Well, I mean, they understood it very well, and they just couldn't say that because, I mean, what would the rationale be if you would concede? You know, you don't even have to like Ho Chi Minh, right, in a sense. If you can concede that 80% of the country does like him, then the rationale for your involvement really is undercut. So yeah, they understand it. I mean, they read these reports coming from Gavin and from the military, which says, yeah, 80% of the people are non-communists, but they like ho. But, you know, they can't take that to its logical conclusion, because that would be an admission that we got to get out. This is a total failure.
Is there any reason that they have to stay in besides the opposition to communism? Are the U.S. World economic interests that strong or even clear at the time?
Yeah. Economic, it's like I said last week, in terms of Vietnam now, they're fairly minimal. But a concept I'll introduce shortly with regard to Kennedy, and it's important already at this time, is something you can't really gauge, but the term credibility often comes into play here. Once the U.S. has made this commitment, I mean, it has to maintain it, because if not, it's perceived, the U.S. fears it's going to be perceived as weakening. So once we do this, you know, once we've anteed up, we can't fold, because then other countries will try to take advantage of us too. And, you know, economically, again, it's a larger thing. You know, we need to maintain this global economy. But specifically, no, there's not real interest there. Yeah, there's clearly anti-communism is quite important, and that's part of credibility. We can't allow other countries to take advantage of us. Vietnam, who cares? But if the Vietnamese do, then, you know, pretty soon somebody else will, and then Guatemala will, and Iran will, and everybody will, and then it'll be anarchy. Yeah, so it's a larger argument.
In the back of the reader here, they talk about what
Which page?
Page 331, founding program of the National Liberation Front
Right.
of South Vietnam.
Yeah.
And there's a list of several principles that the people perceived that they were fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, and I haven't been able to find this in any of the books, what was going on in northern Vietnam during those first few years
I'm going to talk about that shortly.
after partition?
Yeah, we're going to get to that. That's part of the outline. After we do the South, we'll do the North. Let me just finish up here. So the training mission, the U.S. military opposes it, but again, you know, they don't have power. The civilians do. So they say, yeah, you're gonna train, even though, you know, the money's not there. You know, the Army would rather have. The Army estimates it's going to cost $500 million to train the Vietnamese. They'd rather have that money for themselves. To do something else, well, doesn't matter. So essentially, they're fighting a rearguard action, and the training mission is established. At the same time, they oppose SEATO. The U.S. wants to establish this regional group like NATO for Southeast Asia. And the military opposes that too. They simply want to be a consultant to South Vietnam, but again, Dulles and Eisenhower get their way. So SEATO is established too. So the U.S. not only essentially has created the South and taken advantage of it and taken responsibility for it, but agreed that it will create an army, which will become the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which I'll put up there later, and establishes this regional group, this SEATO group, which will then be a regional group then, not only Vietnam, but Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and Burma and other countries. So the U.S. clearly has picked up the ball in Vietnam and is going to take responsibility for it. So what's, per your question, what's happening in Vietnam? I'm going to do first the South and then the North. First of all, we'll talk about the RVN and ZM, and these I think are just photos. Again, they're the same ones I had up there earlier. So if you want to take a look at those again, they're right there. In power, ZM establishes something called the Can Lo Party. Okay, and the Can Lo Party is roughly translated by, well, go back a bit. ZM's brother Nu created the Can Lo Party, and Nu believed in a philosophy of government called personalism. Okay. Essentially, Nu believed that his family deserved the personal loyalty. The Ngo family deserved the personal loyalty of the Vietnamese people. Right. So the United States then commits itself not really to the RVN, or not just to the RVN, but to ZM personally as well. And the Can Lo Party becomes an extension of that. ZM really doesn't have much of a commitment to democracy, and he treats the RVN as a personal fiefdom. The Personalist Party is essentially an appendage of his own family. In order to legitimate himself, in 1955, ZM has elections. Diem receives more votes than there are registered voters in Vietnam. He received 98% of the vote nationally, but in raw votes, he actually got more voters than eligible, more votes than there were eligible voters. So, you know, the rest of the world sees this, but at least he can say now he was elected president. The United States continues to send him money, nearly $500 million in 54 and 55. So he's well on his way. Now, the Can Lo Party and the Ngo family are kind of interesting. It's more than just Diem. His brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and his wife, Madam Nhu, tended to be kind of powers behind the throne, so to speak. Nhu was the Secretary of the Interior, which is always a crucial position in many authoritarian governments because the Interior controls political dissent and things like that. His wife was the head of the Vietnamese women's movement, and she created women's armed paramilitary groups and whatnot. There's a great photo of her I saw in a book today where she's showing several Vietnamese women how to shoot, she's doing handgun training for them to get them you know, kind of worked up to go out and protect the country, the motherland. Okay, Madam Nhu's father was also in the cabinet, in Diem's cabinet, and Madam Nhu's uncle was Diem's foreign minister, and a cousin was the minister of education. Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Con, was the kind of warlord in the area around Hue, and he didn't have any official title. He was just kind of in charge of things. Another one of Diem and Nhu's brothers was the head of the Vietnamese Catholic Church, Bishop Ngo Dinh Thuc. And although maybe 10% at most of Vietnam was Catholic, the church had great power inside this Buddhist country because of the Ngo family's connections to that. I believe another member of the family was an envoy to the Vatican, if I'm not mistaken. So clearly the Ngo family is fairly well taken care of, and they create this Can Lo Party. And to solidify their power further, Diem and Nhu fire about 6,000 army officers when they come to power. So they gut the army, and they replace them with loyal officers who may not be as competent. And many of these officers, if not most, understand that to get ahead, it's good to be a Catholic. So many of them convert, and they also force the officer corps to join the Can Lo Party. The army also takes over civil police functions, and officers take over civil military duties, civil administration duties, so it really does become a police state in that regard. All right, the military is taking over civic functions, and police functions essentially, as we'll see in a minute, become dealing with so-called dissidents. Right? Once they have established this administrative capability inside the RVN, then Diem goes after his enemies, whether real or imagined. And the key to this is a series of laws, and this is the most notable of them. It's called Law 10/59, and it was passed in May of 1959. And this sets out the list of laws which cannot be broken, and a lot of them have to do with loyalty to the Ngo family. Let's see. This is the one thing in here. I think, I don't know if I have a copy of this or not. Sentence of death, confiscated on property, will be imposed on whoever commits or attempts to commit one of the following crimes with the aim of sabotage or upon infringing upon the security of the state or injuring the lives or property of the people. So this you know, infringing upon the security of the state is purposely ambiguous and is generally interpreted quite broadly. So if you somehow oppose Diem or criticize Diem, you are infringing upon the security of the state. And because of that, then, Diem and Nhu go after their enemies with a particular zeal. They make it a crime to criticize the government, and it's a capital offense, punishable by execution, to be a communist. Okay? They also close down newspapers and other media outlets. By 1958, there are over 40,000 political prisoners in RVN jails, and over 12,000 dissidents have been executed in the RVN. And by 1961, those numbers had tripled. And Diem and New actually never tried to hide this. They actually were quite proud of the fact that they had cleaned up the RVN so much. The U.S. understood this. This was an open secret at best. I mean, this was not covered up terribly well. It was well understood. And the U.S. didn't really have any problem with that. He was, to use the old parlance, one of our sons of bitches. So Washington supplied the RVN with 85% of its military budget and 2/3 of its overall budget. So again, I mean, the Republic of Vietnam does not exist without American dollars. Despite this American rhetoric about reform, and it's constantly saying, to Diem, we need to reform, we want to see reform, and so on and so forth. 78% of all American money in the RVN, whether it's appropriated for military or political issues or concerns, is used on military needs for Diem. Okay? And when Diem says that it's going to be used for the military, that essentially means protecting the Ngo family, right, rather than fighting the enemy. So the United States is paying the bills in Vietnam, and Diem is filling the prisons up with political prisoners and so forth. The United States also accepts Diem's land policies. And as I said, the United States has always been hostile to land reform. In 1954-55, when Diem comes to power, land ownership is still a very crucial political issue. In fact, in 1954, after the victory over the French, the Viet Minh begin seizing lands which had been held by the French and by Vietnamese collaborators, and they began to redistribute it. They redistributed over 600,000 hectares of land to landless peasants. Right? So they immediately, as they had done in 1946, begin to get land, take it away from the big planters, kind of like in the South in 1865 and 66 after the U.S. Civil War, and give it to peasants. As soon as Diem comes into power and consolidates his power after the sect crisis and gets the military in line, he begins to retake that land. Diem and his family, the Ngo family, personally took control of 650,000 hectares of land, right? What they do, yeah.
Approximately, what is a hectare to an acre?
I was afraid you're going to say, I think it's bigger than an acre. 2 acres? Okay, I thought it was 2, yeah. I was going to say 2.2, but I think that's a kilometer and meter or whatever, but kilometer a mile, but it's bigger, so it's a lot. It's, let's say, 1.3 million acres, so that's a fairly substantial chunk of change. They take that over. How do they do it? They deny title to the peasants, or they seize it for non-payment of taxes. Okay, and again, if you know anything about the U.S. Civil War, Andrew Johnson, when he becomes president, pardons a lot of Southern planters who go back and take their land. The Freedmen's Bureau, remember, had seized land and was giving it out to ex-slaves. Johnson pardons a lot of planters who go back and they have title to the land, right? It's their land. They have the papers, and of course the courts uphold that. This is exactly what Diem does too. So he reclaims the land, denies peasants title, or charges them tax payments, and in lieu of making these tax payments, he's going to seize their land for them. He gives out about 250,000 hectares to loyal officials and Catholic cronies. He keeps 400,000 acres, the best land, for himself and his family. Okay? So by the later 1950s in South Vietnam, the land situation is really no different than it had been under the French. Diem, at the same time, puts the village councils under the control of his friends. He increases taxes, and he intimidates and arrests those who criticize his land policy. So if a peasant says, that's not fair, that's my land, he very well could be arrested. And in Law 10/59, he authorizes his people to go after subversives, and that's essentially a blank check. And Can Lo zealots, this is something, I mean, certainly not as bad as the Cultural Revolution, but you do have, especially younger Can Lo members going around arresting, trying, and executing people on the spot for disloyalty. All right? Now, there is one real positive benefit to this as far as Diem is concerned. The Viet Minh is on the ropes in the South. Diem has imprisoned and executed so many people that, in fact, he has tearing the guts out of the Viet Minh. There were, according to American Army officials, perhaps 200,000 Viet Minh Southerners who were remaining in the South after '54, who were indigenous opponents of Diem. And by 1959, they're in disarray. The Viet Minh are in real trouble. Many of its members, many of its leaders were imprisoned or dead. Most of its members were in hiding because one did not publicly proclaim that he was a Viet Minh. So Diem, in that regard, which was the most important regard, was doing quite well. David Anderson, who's written a good book on the late 50s, says the U.S. was, quote, trapped by success. Things looked like they were going well in the late 50s. The communist insurgency in the South was getting wiped out. Diem was firmly in charge. The family, yeah, we have some troubles with them, but are they any worse than Somoza? Are they any worse than Castillo Armas in Guatemala? Are they worse than the Shah of Iran? Right? There's this laundry list, so this is, in a sense, it's business as usual. So the U.S. is quite happy with him. Time magazine runs a feature story on him and refers to Ngo Dinh Diem as the Mandarin in the sharkskin suit who was saving Southeast Asia from the communists. Okay? So things look good. The U.S., in a sense, is trapped by success. The communist insurgency is certainly not going well. Diem seems stable, and if the jails are filled with political prisoners, that's a fairly small price to pay for stability and for anti-communism. And so things look pretty good in southern Vietnam by the late 1950s. Okay? What's happening in the north? It's a lot harder, first of all, to find out about stuff in the north. Less work has been done on that because it's just, the United States had a role to play in South Vietnam. The records are there. North Vietnam was a more closed society, and the U.S. had no relationship with them and no contact with them. So it's much harder to figure out what's happening in the north. Okay? So much of this comes through captured documents and through accounts and whatnot. Right? The 1950s were a fairly dark time for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. In the South, they have to deal with seeing many of their friends and supporters suffer under the Diemist repression. And the euphoria of 1954, after they had won at Dien Bien Phu, was replaced by the reality that they had to build a country now. And anybody who's ever won a revolution says that was the easy part. Building the country up afterward is the hard part. And Ho and the DRVN found that out. So they have to organize the North economically, socially, and so forth. And they have to deal with Diem and hopefully sometime reunify the country. After 1956, it's clear that that's not going to happen by election. So they understand that peaceful reunification is definitely unlikely, if not impossible. And so they have no choice but to accept it. They have to accept the fact that the elections ain't going to happen in 56, and they're going to have to deal with it that way. Okay? So the DRVN is essentially isolated. It has no Western support. It cannot go to the World Bank or the IMF or international lending agencies or Western banks to get reconstruction aid. It has to depend upon contributions from the Chinese and the Soviet Union, which tend to be in terms of military aid rather than reconstruction funds. Most of the fighting against the French, meanwhile, had taken place in Tonkin in the north, so that area was damaged and wiped out. About 60% of the rice crop was produced in the south. So what does that say about the north's food supply? It's limited. Okay, so the south controls rice. The north has been damaged badly by the First Indochina War against the French. Dien Bien Phu is up in the north, right? So there are food shortages in the north. The northern economy is in disarray. In fact, Ho Chi Minh even made overtures to Diem and his brother about some kind of economic integration with the South. And again, it was the U.S. which said no way. The U.S. forbade the Nios from talking to Ho Chi Minh about some kind of economic unification of Vietnam. And this helps drive the DRVN even closer to the PRC, to the Chinese and the Soviet Union. So this is another instance of Ho Chi Minh, whether it was sincere or not, one doesn't know because it was never really attempted, but Ho Chi Minh reaches out to Diem and to the U.S. and is rebuffed. Now, internally, the North becomes essentially a communist society. The Lao Dong Party, the Workers' Party, takes over. And this is basically the Communist Party. It's a little sickle and hammer, as you can all tell, right? Ho Chi Minh, in some ways, establishes a society which is fairly typically communist, an economy fairly typically communist. He nationalizes the banks and many large businesses, but he also maintains some private manufacturing and trade firms. So it's a mixed economy. Many of the larger firms and the banks are nationalized, but many other businesses remain in private hands. Right, so this is an attempt to kind of straddle a middle ground. So again, this isn't Bolshevism, this isn't Stalinism or anything like that by any means. Agriculturally, which is the key, because Vietnam, even though the North is more industrialized than the South, Vietnam is still a badly underdeveloped country. So agriculturally, Ho has to reform the country. This is really the key to that. And in 1954, as I just mentioned, he undertakes a land redistribution program. Now in the South, as we said, Diem overturned that. In the North, the government transferred over 2 million hectares of land to the people. And over 50% of northern families became property owners, which really was an exponential increase over the French years. Okay? Ho Chi Minh allows many of the kind of middle, when you think of peasants, we kind of think of people who are poor and in tatters, but in fact there were different levels of peasants as well. And some peasants were actually fairly well off compared to many. So there were middle-class peasants, or rich peasants in fact, and many of Ho's communist cronies wanted to take land from them too. And Ho Chi Minh refused. He tried to keep this somewhat of a mixed economy. He allowed the kind of middle level or the richer peasants to retain their holdings, but Ho Chi Minh channeled everybody's frustration against the class enemies, the people he called the local despots. In every village there was somebody who had a great deal of land, and Ho Chi Minh turned everybody's anger against them. So these local despots became the target for roving bands who would go after these guys and attack and whatnot. Local officials in many cases, however, became overzealous in enacting land reform, and they began to attack peasants who might have held land but didn't adequately have the right kind of ideological fervor. So these people owned land, they supported the government, but Ho Chi Minh's minions, Ho himself is in Saigon, tend to be kind of zealous, and they believe that, you know, even if a guy supports the government, he shouldn't own that much land. And Ho has basically given orders that that was okay, that they could still be part of the system. In various areas then, including Ho Chi Minh's home province of Nha An, peasants begin to protest against the land takings. So what you have then are local officials who are going out and taking land away from middle class or better off peasants, despite Ho saying that that was okay. They could keep their land and they could still be part of North Vietnamese society. In some cases, then, peasants would march. I mean, we talked, you know, in the first class about spontaneous demonstrations, and this is still the case. So quite often peasants would simply protest to the local officials about these land seizures, okay? In too many cases, Lao Dong officials turned on the protesters. In one celebrated instance, the Lao Dong turned on the protesters and killed several hundreds of them. This is one of the most famous acts in North Vietnam, and this has become part of the legend. Richard Nixon in the 1970s, I think 69 or 70, went on TV and he claimed that at one point Ho Chi Minh had slaughtered 500,000 peasants in North Vietnam who were protesting land reform. Well, in fact, that was absurd. You know, you don't kill 500,000 people without a lot of folks finding out about it. The general line was that there were about 2,500 peasants slaughtered. Gareth Porter, who's done some really good work on this, in the 1970s actually went back and studied it and wrote a little pamphlet called The Myth of the Bloodbath, which unfortunately I used to have but can't find. And Porter, based on some pretty good evidence, suggests several hundred were killed, which is still horrific. Okay? Ho Chi Minh, though, and this is, I think, what separates him, in a sense, from Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, whether Ho did it because his own morality or sentiment or whatnot, or maybe he did it out of political expediency, but he realized that his people had gone overboard. They had overreacted. So he chastises the peasants for their uprising, but, and I think this is fairly telling, he sacks those officials who would call the troops out, including Trong Chinh. Trong Chinh was one of Ho's oldest friends, and Ho fired him because he had been part of this repression of the peasants. He had been responsible for the crackdown. So this is a disaster. Several hundred peasants are killed for protesting something that Ho Chi Minh said was okay. You know, wealthier peasants could maintain their land. So this offers a strong contrast, I think, to the Diem regime's behavior, whereas the Nhos boasted of arresting people. Ho remains Uncle Ho after that time. Again, what limited evidence is available, and William Dwiker's book is very good on this, indicates that Ho still retained the support of the people. Now, whether it was, it may have been a good cop, bad cop routine. You know, it may have been, you know, Trong Chin was going to take the fall, and Ho would say, you know, that I didn't have anything to do with that. And Ho may very well have told Trong Chin to go ahead and do it. The fact of the matter is, publicly at least, he was able to maintain credibility after that. A word about Dwiker, because the yellow light is flashing. Dwiker, if you've read any of it yet, is fairly critical of U.S. policy there, and actually tends to see the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh in a fairly even-handed, if not positive light. Dwiker himself is fairly conservative. He's never been known as a raving lefty or anything like that, so I think keep that in mind. This is somebody whose work is fairly well respected and considered fairly balanced and even-handed, and he has this kind of account of it, so that's worth mentioning. Okay. So by 1958-59, things in the South seemed pretty stable, and in the North, Ho was still struggling, trying to figure out how to organize society, but also reunify Vietnam. Okay. Run red.
Dwiker